You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Welcome back. The House and Senate combined to pass nearly 800 bills out of one chamber or the other last week. And now the other chamber is evaluating all those different bills, and they're buckling down for some of the bigger negotiations, not just the energy legislation, but also the budget. Governor Pritzker has made a lot of changes to his fiscal outlook and his planning in this year after the coronavirus. Joining us now is Republican Senator Don DeWitte. Good to have you with us.
Thanks, Mark.
I remember back to Governor Pritzker's first year in office when he was starting to roll out his vision of how the state budget should look and operate. And he was very proud of one thing in that budget, the Blue Collar Jobs Act. These were tax breaks, as I understand it, for construction projects that were completed. The companies couldn't collect until after they finished the job. Is that right?
Correct.
But now he's saying we're going to pump the brakes on that. We can't afford it during COVID. I believe you were helping to negotiate those tax breaks into the budget at the time. Is that right?
I was more involved on the capital side, to be honest with you. You may recall, Mark, that in exchange for Republican support on his Rebuild Illinois program, which was the $45 million capital bill, he agreed to support the business initiatives, of which he's now having discussions about eliminating, the Blue Collar Jobs Act being the major component of that piece of legislation. But you know, it was classic. I'll support you on this issue if you'll support us on that issue. You know, one of the nexus of doing business here in Springfield. Frankly, we're real disappointed that he's taking a second look at those potential tax credits that we believe could create jobs in Illinois, give businesses incentives to expand their businesses. It's disappointing, but things change, and we understand that.
Things change. That was exactly, you took the words from my
Right.
mouth. I suppose devil's advocate or the governor's office, were they here, might say, yeah, we had hoped to do those things. Then the coronavirus happened, and maybe now we just can't afford it anymore. Is it really so much that the governor is reneging, or that he's adjusting to the changing reality?
Well, unfortunately, it's probably a little bit of both. You know, one of the keys to being successful, I believe, in Springfield is becoming known as an honest broker. Once you give your word on a particular issue, whether it's to support something or, frankly, to oppose something, I think it's important that elected officials, doesn't matter whether you're a House member, a senator, or the governor, if you give your word to something, typically people take that to the bank, so to speak. And we're disappointed he's revisiting that issue. It would not surprise me to see that on a list of things that may be reconsidered. You know, we're approaching the end of May here, which is really crunch time for the budget process. We're hoping some of those issues are still on the table to at least have a conversation about, to try to recover some of that stuff.
So you think the governor is still open to reconsidering there? I believe, if my timeline is correct, when he said we're going to go ahead and end those blue-collar jobs tax credits, that was before the good news that Congress would be sending $7.5 billion to replenish the state's budget coffers. So perhaps there's some wiggle room.
Well, two things. I hope there is some wiggle room. I think, again, the key to doing business here in Springfield is being able to negotiate, and I'm hoping those issues are still on the list of things he's willing to talk about. With regards to federal aid that might be coming from Washington, the comptroller and the governor have both made it fairly clear to everybody that most of that money is going to be used to take care of debt that we have picked up. The biggest portion of that will be money we have borrowed from the federal government, nearly $5 billion, that will be the priority in taking care of how that $7.5 billion gets used. There's other uses that some of that leftover funds could be used for. It could be used to replenish some revenue in some areas. It could be used to continue to pay down debt that the state has accumulated.
Mm-hmm. It was some news on that front too, just quickly. The comptroller's office reporting this week that the bill backlog that used to be higher than $16 billion, I think, is now down to $3.5 billion. Now, there are still structural problems in the Illinois budget where if we don't change that somehow, it's going to creep back up again. But she's taken that borrowed money from the Federal Reserve and paid the backlog down to where most providers are being paid on a pretty regular 30 or 60-day cycle now.
Sure. The other thing that has helped that process is revenues that are running above projection through January, February, and March of 2021 on the revenue side. A lot of it is driven by unemployment insurance that has been paid out to the thousands and hundreds of thousands of Illinois residents that have been out of work because of the pandemic. That's pure increase in revenue. That's the bulk of the funds that the comptroller has used to pay down that debt on the accounts payables. I think it was a good decision. I think anything we can do to start the process of lowering our debt. We're back down to a 30-day cycle paying our receivables in this state. So I think that's a good thing, but to the point about the federal aid, we're still going to need to see where some of that leftover funds after those federal borrowed funds are paid back, where some of that money can be used.
All right, let's go back to 2019 once again. Governor Pritzker just in office passing the capital bill. It was going to take a lot of, we doubled the gas tax, right? And in Illinois, there's not just the motor fuel tax or the gas tax, but there's also a sales tax that you pay at the pump. Many people who, maybe you're familiar with it. If you take a closer look at your receipt, you'll see it right there at the gas station.
Correct.
Illinois was in the process of taking the sales tax from the gas and adding it into the lockbox. The motor fuel tax is already in that lockbox many of you know about, where it has to be spent on transportation projects. The sales tax wasn't in there yet. It was kind of going in there, and the Pritzker administration in this new budget again said, well, let's slow that process down. We want to keep some of that money from the sales tax in our budget. Is that appropriate?
Well, whether it's appropriate or not, we're going to have to find out. Again, I think that's one of those issues that's going to end up on the negotiating table once we start putting a final budget together. But your point is absolutely correct. The plan was to transition pure sales taxes from the general revenue fund on a 5-year basis to work it over to the road fund to help pay for horizontal capital improvements in the state through the capital bill.
Horizontal meaning roads, bridges,
bridges, sidewalks, exactly.
We're not building buildings with it.
That's correct. That's the vertical side of the capital bill. So the governors decided to pause the transition of those sales tax or general revenue fund revenues and keep them in the general fund, again, to help reinforce the state's revenue side of the equation.
How does that affect those projects, those different types of infrastructure upgrades that are on the long list at the Department of Transportation to accomplish? If that money isn't there,
sure.
Is that a big dent? To what extent is that slowing down construction? I
don't think it's a massive dent, Mark. I think it's a marginal reduction in revenues that will simply shorten the list of projects over the 6-year course of the plan that can be ultimately built. Can the state budget in the next 5 or 6 years recover to the point where we can quickly bring that sales tax back into the road fund or capital fund? My crystal ball is no clearer than anybody else's at this point, but it will shorten the number of projects we can get done, and we're just going to have to watch how the revenue moves forward as we start to come out of the pandemic. People start traveling again. Gas sales have been very reduced in the state. People just aren't driving. They're not commuting to work. They're not taking vacations.
So on that, I won't ask you to predict the future, but I will ask you to evaluate the recent past. Because of that, the gas tax being zapped a bit, what is that doing to the capital bill, and how do you grade the rollout of the capital bill to date?
I think the rollout of the capital bill, I would grade it as probably a C+ or a B-. Most of that work is still being done through IDOT. IDOT had a significant backlog just in general maintenance for roads, bridges in the state. A lot of that work continues. It's not continuing as aggressively as we would like. It's been like the sales tax. It's been a marginal dent in the revenue stream. We're just having to adjust the amount of work we're doing accordingly. The bill was originally planned as a 6-year piece of legislation. There's already been discussion with my colleague Ron Villavelam on the Senate Transportation Committee. That project could very well go from 6 years to maybe 7 or 8 years to basically extend the amount of time that we have based on what will hopefully be an increasing revenue stream. We can expand the length of the bill to get more work done down the road. It'll just take longer to complete it.
All right, we're talking about a lot of different infrastructure upgrades. I want to go back to the initial question, though, which was about these blue-collar jobs. It sounded like you think the governor might reconsider and might put this back on. He might renew the tax credit program, so to speak. What's at stake if he doesn't? If he phases those out, what happens?
Well, I think if the governor goes ahead and chooses to eliminate some of those business incentives that he agreed to, I think it will continue to cost jobs in the state of Illinois. It will not give businesses incentives to make the investments to expand, to grow their businesses, to put these people to work with additional construction projects. Across the board, I think it will exacerbate some of the employment issues that we're currently dealing with in the state from the pandemic.
You mentioned being an honest broker helps moving forward. I think that's an interesting point, because if there are businesses looking at saying, okay, we're going to build a project here, it's at some point they have to ask themselves, can I count on, how do I balance that out? I want to test that, your resolve with that principle about once the state has made a promise, it must keep it. Do you hold that same view when it comes to public sector pensions?
Yes. I think this state has an obligation to meet the pension requirements that have been contractually negotiated for state and public employees. So the answer to your question is yes.
So you point to the contract before you point to the Constitution that says the benefit cannot be diminished.
Well, correct, because these pension benefits are contractually negotiated for the vast majority of public employees who will receive those benefits.
So you're saying the contract is the promise, not the Constitution?
That's correct. Now, the Constitution can be changed to allow for a restructuring of the pension program, but my position since the day I walked into this building 3 years ago now has been that the only way that logically can happen is to have those pension members and the people responsible for monitoring those pensions sitting at the table with the legislature to try to find solutions to correcting what is clearly an unsustainable scenario where pension benefits are being paid out at a much quicker pace than the revenues coming in can support it. There's a point of diminishing returns. Some of these pension funds are marginally funded. I mean, you've got pension funds up north in the city of Chicago, 15, 18, 20% funded. That's a major problem long term, and unless everybody gets to the table to find solutions, it's not going to get any better.
It's all connected one way or the other. He's close to the budget process, the Capitol bill, a lot of these interesting conversations down the stretch. Senator Don DeWitte, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
We're back in a moment with House Democrat Camille Lilly, how the state looks to tackle systemic racism in healthcare. That's next.